Hello and welcome to Indianomics. The Reserve Bank has given itself a new goal on NPAs or bad loans.
I want to put something like March 2017 on the table as when we hope that a full cleanup will have been done.
Well, today on Indianomics, we discuss how big is the bad loan problem. 2, should banks recognize more of the bad loans more ruthlessly? And 3, can banks possibly provide for all the bad loans in 6 quarters? We'll be speaking with 2 stalwarts, Mr. G. Padmanabhan, former Executive Director of Reserve Bank and now Chairman, Bank of India, and Mr. C.V.R. Rajendran, recently retired Chairman of Andhra Bank. We will thereafter be also joined by SBI Chairman Arundhati Bhattacharya. But first, here are some numbers from a recent Credit Suisse report. Credit Suisse says it has studied 3,700 companies with an aggregate debt of $500 billion or 33 lakh crore rupees. 21% of this debt is with companies whose EBITDA or earnings before interest, depreciation, tax and amortization is less than their debt for the last 4 quarters. Now that works out to nearly 7 lakh crores of debt that is under stress. 2, Credit Suisse says 4 lakh crore or $63 billion of debt is held by companies whose earnings before interest and tax is less than the interest bill for 12 quarters in a row. What's worse, only 10% of this debt has been marked as NPAs so far. 3, the brokerage believes that the gross NPLs account for 5.8% as of September, but stressed assets, that is NPAs plus restructured assets, account for 11%. More important, adding the chronically indebted companies, the load will work out to 16% of bank loans. 4, 85% of public sector banks, accounting for 50% of the loans, have their Tier 1 capital less than 8% and unprovided problem loans accounting for 100% of their net worth. Pre-provisioning operating profit for PSU banks declined by 2% in September 2015 from their year-ago levels. Also, the NPA coverage for PSU banks is between 30 and 50%. Well, those are the facts. And now I'm joined by Mr. G. Padmanabhan, the former Reserve Bank ED and currently our Bank of India Chairman, and Mr. C.V.R. Rajendran, just retired Chairman of Andhra Bank. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me in our studios. Well, Mr. Rajendran, since until very recently you ran a bank, what is your sense? Is the truth at 5.8% of the book? Is it at 11% of the book? Or is it, at Credit Suisse says, at 16% of the book?
It all depends upon how you take that number. Okay, if you take the NPAs plus the restructured accounts plus the SRs which are outstanding plus the 5/25 which you have done over a period, under the SMA accounts also, it could be 16%.
No, that is definition.
Right.
What I'm asking you is, as a banker, do you really think 16% of the book is so stressed that it has to be provided for? Or, as several bankers claim, that much of it or some of it can be retrieved?
No, most of it can be retrieved. It may not result in an ultimate loss to the banks. But the only thing is whether it will be in a position to service the debt according to the original schedules and will be in a position to remain outside the NPA purview. They may not. I feel that 11% may not be a very wrong estimate. 11% is under stress.
Okay.
For which some of the accounts could be in a position to service the debt as on date, which are able to do as per the restructured terms. Okay. The fear comes when the restructuring moratorium is over and when they start repaying for the loan as per the schedule, whether they will generate sufficient cash flows to service the interest and the installments which are falling due. Okay. It will be possible provided the economic turnaround happens and the capacity utilization increases. Okay. That is the assumption which you have made.
Okay, no, the assumption that the 16% is not stressed rests on the assumption that some of it can be given to better promoters. After all, that is the purpose of the strategic debt restructuring. The promoter is beleaguered, but the asset is good. If you take that assumption, that it goes, a steel company goes to, say, Tata Steel, whose promoter has deep pockets, even if the company is under stress. If you take that assumption, do you think still 16% is stressed, Mr. Padmanabhan?
So first of all, I wouldn't know how this figure has been arrived at. On the face of it, it looks a little high. That's all I can say, because I will not be able to say this for the system as a whole. But having said that, I think if we are taking into account the possible success of all these measures that have been put in at different points of time, the numbers definitely will be much lower. But the point that is being driven at is that if you start cleaning up the balance sheet, once the positive things happen, at that point of time when you start reversing these provisions, then we are going to end up with a banking system which is very strong. I think that's the idea which needs to be appreciated.
Okay. But given the capital constraints, I mean, the government has promised 70,000 crores by way of capital and hopes that the rest will be raised by the banks. You must have done the math up until when you were there in Andhra Bank. Do you think that capital will permit you to recognize a lot of loans? Is it that loans are not being recognized because you have a problem of capital? Given the capital numbers, can banks now recognize up to, say, 8% of their book?
If you talk only about the bank which I served, they will be in a position to do it because our provision coverage ratio was 62% at that point of time when I left the bank. And they had a lot of room for raising the Tier 2 bonds, Tier 1 bonds, as well as capital also. So even without going to the equity market, which I was not very particular going because the book value, even at least one-time book value I wanted to have as a price. So even if I raise only the Tier 1, Tier 2 bonds as per my eligibility, I will be in a position to manage the capital requirements. And there is appetite for these banks' bonds in the market. Okay. And there could be one more thing which can happen, is a windfall gain of
Andhra Bank could have recognized 11% or whatever their restructured plus.
Whatever the restructured assets which are likely to slip. Not everything is slipping. Okay, maybe about, my experience was 10 to 12% of the restructured assets were slipping every year. Bank will be in a position to provide for it. That may not be a problem for that bank. But that bank had a large amount of NPA and restructured accounts, more than this 11% together. But still they will be in a position to provide for it. They had the wherewithal and their profits were sufficient.
What is your sense for the system, Mr. Padmanabhan? I know I'm asking you to exercise your extrapolation a bit too much, but you've seen it from the regulator's end and now you know at the bank end as well. Do you think that with the 70,000 crore of capital and a little bit of retained earnings, the banking system will be able to provide for most of the stressed loans, assuming that, say, 30% of the stressed loans will fail?
I have a slightly different take on this. I mean, let's not worry about the numbers. The question is whether the capital that's coming in or that's likely to come in can be entirely used for just declaring bad assets. No, I think it's a combination of you should be able to grow and then earn, and it's a combination of that which should take care of the problem on a sustained basis. For every time if we think that if there are bad loans, capital is being pumped in, then you recognize more bad loans. I think that's not the way forward. So I think that's the balance we are trying to strike, I think even in the Bank of India, and that's how, in my view, it should be the way forward.
What's your sense